welcome everyone to our Scholars in the Square lecture for this evening. Hello to those of you joining us online and in the future on YouTube. My name is Rachel Brown, and I'm the director of the Center for Studies in Religion Society here at UVic. As a reminder, our SITS format unfolds as follows. First, our speaker, Matt Sheedy, will offer a 20-minute public presentation, and then he will engage in a 20-minute period of conversation with Dr. Ramy, Department Chair and Associate Professor of Religious Studies at Cape Breton University, whose research focuses on religion in various media discourses and on Islam in Canada, among many, many other things. And Ruby is also a longtime friend of the center and was on our advisory council for many years. And then after Matt and Ruby talk for 20 minutes, I will chair a 20-minute open discussion period. Our speaker for this evening is Dr. Matt Sheedy. Matt teaches in the Department of Religion at the University of Manitoba and taught in the North American Studies program at the University of Bonn from 2017 to 2025. His research interests include critical social theory, theories of secularism and religion, and contemporary narratives on Islam, atheism, Christianity, and indigenous religious traditions in North American popular and political culture. His most recent book is Owning the Secular: Religious Symbols, Culture Wars, Western Fragility, published with Routledge in 2021. He's currently working on a book titled Islam According to Google News: How Media Shapes the Way We Talk About Religion, on which his talk tonight is partly based. Matt is also an avid sports fan and a born and bred Torontonian, so thankfully his talk wasn't scheduled for tomorrow, or else we'd all be meeting in the pub so he could keep an eye on the Jays game. Matt's work on representations of religious, spiritual, secular, and indigenous communities and individuals in popular and political culture, with articles and chapters such as Reimagining Indigenous Settler Relations in the Revenant and Critical Religion versus Critical Islam in Indigenous Studies, Insiders, Outsiders, Activists, help us to think about the ways that certain communities are minoritized and majoritized through various forms of public discourse. An important thing to keep in mind when reflecting on questions of reconciliation, sovereignty, and Indigenous settler relations. And so I want to acknowledge and respect the Lekwungen, Songhees, and Wisconsin and Esquimalt peoples on whose traditional territory the university stands, and the Lekwungen and Wisconsin peoples whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. And now please join me in welcoming Matt.
Thank you, Rachel. I'm just going to start a timer here to keep myself honest. So the way this is going to work out, as you all know, is that we'll have a conversation with myself and Dr. Ramy, and then a 20-minute Q&A. So this part's going to go very fast. I have a lot of slides, so it's going to require your attention, but I hope the audio from me, the visual from there, will help to drive home some of the ideas that I'm getting to. Much of it is introductory, and I hope we can dig deeper in the Q&A. So without further ado, I'd like to start with a teaser. So in 2012, scholar Evelyn Ossitani wrote a book called Arabs and Muslims in the Media. This has been a very well-received book when thinking about Muslims in North American popular culture. On her very first page, she writes the following. She says, "Demonizing the enemy is so common during times of war. I assumed that September 11th, 2001, and the war on terror would ignite the blanket demonization of all Arabs and Muslims, given that the US media has stereotyped and misrepresented Arabs and Muslims for over a century. I couldn't believe that sympathetic portrayals would appear during such a fraught moment." And this book was the product of her PhD thesis at Stanford. And this question, this idea that there were more sympathetic portrayals post 9/11 was what prompted her to dig into this particular topic. So that is a bit of a teaser. And so is this. Her follow-up book 10 years later is called Broken: The Failed Promise of Muslim Inclusion, where she looks at shows from 2010 to 2020 and comes to a rather gloomy conclusion. In terms of my approach, and I'm happy to say more about this afterwards, I take a critical materialist approach to my topic. I tend to focus, and certainly in this case, on the relationship between power, ideology, and cultural narratives. Also, if you're interested, ask me about Sarah Ahmed's concept, effective conversion points, which I think nicely highlights a lot of what I'm doing here. So, starting with the question of popular culture. This is a very large topic that I can't do justice to in this very short time, but I do want to sort of situate my own particular approach in relation to a much broader field. So there is a text called the Bloomsbury Handbook of Muslims and Popular Culture that came out in 2023. Our own Dr. Rachel Brown has a chapter in there. And I thought I would highlight some of the categories that fall under popular culture in this text. These include architecture, food culture, performative arts, so music, theater, and sports, literature, pop art, film, and mass media. So I am dealing primarily with popular TV shows in Canada and the United States. So that's how I'm situating popular culture for the purpose of this talk. So a common starting point on this topic, as many of you might anticipate, is Edward Said and his seminal 1978 text, Orientalism. A few key highlights from this text is that it deals with the Western construction and imaginary of the East and of Islam. So Said's analysis focused on European literature, art, and scholarship from the 18th to the 20th centuries, and it has had a profound influence since its release. This includes literary, post-colonial, cultural, critical race, and decolonial studies, among other fields and subfields. Another important text that I want to very briefly mention related to my topic is Jack Shaheen's 2001 book, Real Bad Arabs. There was a documentary which you can find online of the same name featuring Shaheen in 2006. And in his book, he catalogs over 1,000 Hollywood films that deal with depictions of Arabs and Muslims, and concludes, not surprisingly, that these depictions were overwhelmingly racialized, stereotypical, and negative. Here are but a few of those examples from Hollywood and popular culture, including the 1921 film Chic, Warner Brothers cartoons, Alibaba, Disney's Aladdin, and the examples go on and on. I also want to mention very briefly, when thinking about empirical studies on representations of Muslims, in this case in newspapers, which is a part of the larger book project I'm looking at, probably the most comprehensive study is Bleich and van der Veen's Covering Muslims. They give a conscious nod in their title to Edward Said's 1981 book, Covering Islam, where they collect data from 1996 to 2016, literally over 1 million newspapers. So they do a quantitative computational data analysis, and they were interested in the tone of these newspaper articles. And they came to the conclusion that 84% of them had a negative tone when referring to Muslims. So this provides some interesting empirical data that confirms what a lot of cultural studies scholars in a more qualitative sense already got a feel for. Very, very briefly, the role of political conflicts. Flashpoint events such as the Israeli-Palestinian conflict dating back at least to 1948, although before that as well, has been and continues to be an ongoing flashpoint that relates to images and ideas surrounding Muslims and Islam. And indeed, there's no shortage of Hollywood films that takes up this topic, including the 2005 Academy Award-winning film Munich, which focuses on the incident in Munich during the Olympics where 9 Israelis were killed by members of the Palestinian Liberation Organization. Skipping over a bunch of history, another really important event was the Iranian Revolution in 1979 that saw the Ayatollah Khomeini come to power and usher in a theocratic regime. And what is really important with the Iranian Revolution, and many scholars have commented on this fact, is that prior to this time, a lot of conflicts involving what we generally refer to as the Middle East were often referred to along political and or ethnic lines, right? So it was the Middle East and Arabs that were sort of the dominant framing. But with the Iranian Revolution, Islam and Muslims came to be more common in terms of the sources and the understanding and interpretation of these conflicts. And there was yet another Academy Award-winning film on the Iranian hostage crisis in 2012, starring and directed by Ben Affleck, who will come up again later in our presentation. Another thing I want to mention very briefly is the clash of civilizations. I have no time to discuss the 1989 Salman Rushdie affair and its aftermath, but the question of free speech, whether or not the so-called Muslim world allows for free speech, unlike the so-called Western world, is something that we see evoked time and time again. The Rushdie affair in '89 was a huge flashpoint event, as was the Charlie Hebdo controversy in or pardon me, 2015, where a number of individuals were murdered in Paris who worked for the satirical magazine Charlie Hebdo. If you are interested in this topic, particularly the Danish cartoon controversy from 2005, ask me more about the very interesting work of Sabah Mahmoud and Talal Assad, particularly their comments on this Danish cartoons affair in the 2009 book, Is Critique Secular, Blasphemy, Injury, and Speech? I would be remiss not to mention the influence of Bernard Lewis, who coined the term the clash of civilizations in his Atlantic article in 1990 called The Roots of Muslim Rage. That is the actual cover that they went with in 1990. And this term was taken up by a number of people during that time after the fall of the Soviet Union, where, according to prominent political scientists like Samuel Huntington, who penned a book in 1996 called The Clash of Civilizations and the Remaking of the World Order, argued that after the fall of the Soviet Union, the West's primary enemy was going to become so-called Islamic civilization. And this got a renewed life in the wake of the September 11th, 2001 attacks. And indeed, both Lewis and Huntington and many others appeared in popular media talking about this idea. It lasted probably for about a decade or so, although one doesn't hear that phrase so much anymore. Another key term is the role of culture talk. This was popularized by Mahmoud Mamdani in his 2004 book, Good Muslim, Bad Muslim, America, the Cold War, and the Roots of Terror. I'd just like to read you a passage from that book where Mamdani writes the following. He says, it is no longer the market or capitalism, nor the state, democracy, but culture or modernity, right? Who is modern and who is not, who is backwards and primitive, that is said to be the dividing line between those in favor of a peaceful civic coexistence and those inclined to terror. If that name is familiar to anyone, he is the father of Zoran Mamdani, the very likely next mayor of New York City. And it's also worth noting that his mother is the famous filmmaker. Oh my God, I'm blanking on her name.
Nair.
Sorry?
Nair?
Nair. Mira, I believe. Mira Nair, yes. The reluctant fundamentalist, Mississippi Masala, among other films.
Salam Bombay.
Salam Bombay, yes. All right, so moving on to tracing representational shifts. So this returns us to Evelyn Al-Satanian. One of the concepts that she puts forward in her book is what she calls simplified complex representations. She writes the following on this concept. She says, the representational mode that has become standard since 9/11 seeks to balance a negative representation with positive one. So unlike the pre-9/11 period where there were overwhelmingly one-dimensional negative portrayals of Arabs and Muslims, she found that there was this tendency to always represent a positive figure along with a negative one in TV shows following 9/11. She continues, this feature of a post-9/11 representation is consistent with Mahmoud Mamdani's claim that the public debate since the terrorist attacks has involved a discourse about good and bad Muslims, in which all Muslims are assumed to be bad until they perform and prove their allegiance to the US nation. So shows like 24, which I think had like 20 seasons, something along those lines, the lesser known Sleeper Cell, all reproduced this good Muslim, bad Muslim trope, where good Muslims typically were overly patriotic and often working for the police, the FBI, or the CIA. Another popular show along these lines was Homeland, which some of you might be aware of, dealing with CIA agents. From Little Mosque to Zarqa, or the fight to be flogged. So Little Mosque on the Prairie, which some of you might know, was the first Euro-Western show to feature and focus on an all-Muslim cast. Muslim characters had been peripheral in a number of other films and shows. This was the first film, or show rather, to focus exclusively on Muslim cultures and communities. And not surprisingly, it sparked a lot of conversation and controversy. So one important text that digs into Little Mosque is by Kyle Conway. It came out in 2017, Little Mosque on the Prairie, and the Paradoxes of Cultural Translation. I can't say too much about this for the sake of time, but one of the things that Conway talks about is how the show, which was produced by the CBC, engaged in forms of cultural translation. And he argues that it was constrained by what writers and producers think will sell, and what they think will sell to a largely non-Muslim audience, right? So Islam 101 was very much what they were engaged with. This is something he called saleable diversity, appealing to moderation and downplaying differences. Scholar Shalina Kassam wrote an interesting essay on Little Mosque, where she argues that Little Mosque on the Prairie, even as it challenges Orientalist stereotypes, reinforces key hegemonic messages central to the Canadian national imaginary. She continues, in particular, I argue that the sitcom foregrounds an idealized moderate Muslim who is represented as liberal, modern, and one who seamlessly integrates her faith into the multicultural fabric of Canada. And just as a side note, there's a really interesting book by Rosemary Corbett called The Making of Moderate Islam on the so-called Ground Zero Mosque controversy in 2010. Now, the takeaway, or what I want to stress here in relation to this idea of the moderate Muslim, is that it highlights similarity and moderation over struggle and differences. Shifts in representation, 2010 to 2020 and beyond. So returning to Evelyn Al-Sitani's 2022 book, Broken, the Failed Promise of Muslim Inclusion. Here she explores what she calls stereotyped confined expansions. So she did notice some changes after 2010 in terms of how Muslims were depicted in US TV shows. I've listed a few of them at the bottom there. However, she notes that they remain confined to these older good Muslim, bad Muslim stereotypes. So she talks about normative Muslims. We've heard about the patriotic Muslim. There's also the moderate Muslim, and that is nicely represented by Imam Faisal Abdul Rauf, who was the main imam at the Islamic Community Center in Manhattan that got dubbed the Ground Zero Mosque. And there was also the figure of the native informant, so someone who is either Muslim or a former Muslim, speaking about Islam and getting elevated in the media, often by Islamophobic figures, in order to say things that non-Muslims often can't say themselves. Ayaan Hirsi Ali came out with a number of texts that were very much uplifted by the likes of Fox News and others, and she is representative of what Al-Sitani would call a native informant. Another term she comes up with in her second book is the nominal Muslim. So this is something that she notes really started to come to the forefront in the era between 2015 and 2020, where she argues Hollywood was responding to Trump's Muslim ban. And the basic idea behind the nominal Muslim was that Muslims can be included as long as their Islam is cultural and secular, right? So a lot of cultural Muslims who were seen interacting with their more devout family members, but very much distant themselves from their religiosity. Another example of this is the popular Netflix show Master of None, starring Aziz Ansari. Commentators have also pointed out that in programs like this, the Muslim protagonist often has a white girlfriend. I have absolutely no time to talk about another trope she calls the heroic Muslim, but it has to do with real-time Bill Maher, a very controversial exchange dating back to 2014. And Malala Yousafzai asked me about that in the Q&A if you are curious. We have about 5 minutes left, so moving on to Miss Marvel. Miss Marvel was first produced in comic book form in 2013, and there is one episode, not likely to be another, or pardon me, season, not likely to be another one, at least at this point, which exists within the Marvel universe. As a side note, if you're interested in Muslim superheroes, there's a great book edited by David Lewis and Martin Lund on this topic. Miss Marvel was transformative and moved away from a lot of these stereotypes, particularly the nominal Muslim, in any number of ways. I've listed a few of them here. The show stresses the role of British colonialism in shaping Pakistani-American identity. So, for example, through flashbacks plus 2 episodes that take place in present-day Karachi. They deal with the post-9/11 experience of state surveillance, particularly surveillance of mosques. They tend to subvert racial stereotypes by flipping the power dynamic with white characters in the show. And there's a generational tension that really comes through. So migrant parents versus first-generation kids and their struggle to balance their American identities versus their familial ties to, in this case, Pakistani and Muslim norms. Another interesting show It is in its second season on Netflix, is Mo. And this speaks directly in interesting ways to a point that Shalina Kazam, commenting on Little Mosque on the Prairie, made in that previously mentioned essay. And I want to read you a little bit from a quote from that essay, where she says, in relation to Little Mosque, rarely does the sitcom probe the nuances and differences beneath the doctrinal veneer of the lives of its characters. She continues at the bottom there that faith is the primary signifier through which Muslims view their identities. Mo very much flips the script on this. He is not a nominal Muslim. He is a practicing Muslim. His Islam comes through in the show, but it is not nearly as significant as his status as a refugee, as his connection to Houston, where he lives, as his relationship with Mexican culture and his Mexican girlfriend. He speaks Spanish in the show, he speaks Arabic in the show, and he is also of Palestinian origin. So all these complex intersectional identities are mixed with his Muslim identity in a way that really moves beyond this nominal Muslim trope. Remy is, in my estimation, the most subversive and interesting of all these shows. It was starred by and written by Ramy Youssef, who won a Golden Globe for this program. A few highlights here, and I'd love to talk more about Ramy in the Q&A. It resists presenting Muslim life solely through the lens of Islamophobia. There's an interesting line where he's on a date in the first episode, and he says to his date, you know, the day the Muslim ban dropped was actually a good day for me. More on that if you're curious in the Q&A. Unlike the nominal Muslim, Ramy embraces Islam, is a deeply flawed character, and engages with Muslim and or Arab themes, often without explanation. So they're not giving Muslim 101 to their audience. They're just presenting cultural norms without explanation, as though they are part of the American fabric. And to close things off, the CBC web series Zarqa, there's 2 seasons, although they both appear in 2022, also subverts a lot of the older tropes. And so it's very much a screwball comedy. Zarqa's getting divorced. She's in Regina, Saskatchewan, and her husband is marrying a white yoga teacher. And so in order to get back at him, she wants to go on a date, and bring a date rather, with a white brain surgeon. She happens to find one online. And throughout the show, there's a lot of subversive sort of jokes at the expense of generic whiteness in Canada. And even at the very end, and you can see this in the slide on the far right, she makes her money selling exotic, culturally appropriated products to a white audience. And so it's very much flipping the script on a lot of stereotypical points of view, and also presenting this deeply flawed character who does not have to be a good Muslim. And so it's a really interesting sort of bookend to this conversation, thinking about Zarqa Nawaz, who started Little Mosque on the Prairie and was able to do a lot more with Zarqa. So just to close things off, I'm just about at time now. I want to pose some questions to consider. Have shows like Mo, Remy, Zarqa, and Miss Marvel set a new standard for Muslim focused storytelling? And if so, to what ends? How does audience reception play a role? So here I'm thinking audience reception both among insiders, so Muslim cultures and communities, and outsiders, non-Muslims, especially on social media. There are huge conversations taking place in these spaces about these shows. How are Muslims and Islam narrated in Trump's America and Carney's Canada today? What impact do current alliances with states like Saudi Arabia and Qatar, for example, have on Western imaginaries of Islam and Muslims? And finally, how do images and narratives around Gaza reshape the Western imaginary on Muslims and Islam? And I'll just leave with the following point on Hamas. Unlike the period following 9/11, where there was a disproportionate emphasis on Muslims and Islam as a primary culprit of terrorism, I find that there's a lot more conversation about Hamas today than there was back then. So thinking through some of the implications of language and signifiers and how it reorients the conversation in different ways. So we can think of no doubt many more questions, but those are a few that might prompt some questions. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
We'll move to the conversation between Ruby and Matt. So Ruby, we're just getting you up on the screen here. And yeah, go ahead.
I really don't know where to start. Matt's given me a lot of information to work with here. I've also done, I apologize, I have 4 dogs in the house right now. and I am on Atlantic time, so it's like 9 p.m. here. So if they start whining, I apologize as one whines in the background. Um, I've looked at North American film, specifically American film, up to 2001, and then what happened after 2001. And one of the things that I think is important to remember is that people draw themselves to things they know, give them some sort of understanding. So when 9/11 happened, people actually flocked to the movies. They started looking at what films were available to understand Muslims. They wanted to know who these people were. Um, The Siege, which was made in 1998, so 3 years, before 9/11, was ranked number 3 in selling DVDs. We also had True Lies, which was made in 1994, even older, which was ranked number 5 in DVD sales. Air Force One, made in 1997, was ranking 10 times higher than it had at any point in time, even when it first came out. The spokesperson for Rogers, a Canadian outlet, basically said that people were trying to gain insight on the event as well as understanding this plot. They saw it as a Hollywood plot. They weren't actually sure if this was a movie or not. So it kind of became this ununderstandable phenomenon to them. Terrorism got equated to a lot of different things. They basically wanted to understand, who these people were. And unfortunately, up until this period of time, American movies really focused on the fact that Arabs were Muslims and Muslims were Arabs and they were the terrorists. And so that image, I feel, has never left us. So even with shows that have come out since then, with the shows of Little Mosque on the Prairie and a lot of, I know there's one thing that you didn't bring up, but I know that you're doing research on comedians, is this idea of trying to bring in a racialization and a diversity of Islam into what we see. So we see comedians who are Black, who are Arab, who are Pakistani, who are Indonesian, and kind of setting the tone for it to be different. But one of the problems we tend to forget, and it drives me a little crazy, is the role of women in these movies. So in the early days, women were either seen in harems, they were belly dancers, and then by the time we got up to like the 2000s, they basically became invisible or silent. They wore hijabs, not just hijabs, sorry, they wore the chador or the burqa, and they were silent in all of these movies. So basically, we didn't get to hear from them. And what ends up happening, I think, not just historically, but what has happened politically, is that we have seen this idea of what the Muslim is become essentialized again, but it's become essentialized on the body of the Muslim woman, who wears the niqab and wears the chador. Basically, one of the things that I tend to bring up is when I was doing research on North American news, Canadian and American, and any time an article came up about Islam and it was about terrorism or even politics, there would be a woman in a burqa or a chador, even if it had nothing to do with a woman. And then what ended up happening was that we saw the idea of the chador and the burqa become a sign of fear. This comes out in a few movies, but really what ends up becoming a big deal is that basically a lot of countries start banning the burqa and the chador for not just political reasons, but ideas about it being a way for barbaric and violent men to control women. Also, this idea where they shouldn't be out in the public spaces because it somehow goes against secularism, which is what France said. It goes against safety and security, which is what a lot of other countries said. Just in 2025, this year alone, we've had 5 countries ban the hijab, the chador, and the burqa: Portugal, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Senegal, and Switzerland. That makes it 22 now. Most of them are in Europe, but we have Muslim countries now starting to do this as a sign of saying, we're going to look like you. We want to be inclusive. So we're going to ban the 2 things that you think are tied to terrorism. And I think that that's actually become an outlet that we forget and say, yeah, those are the ones that are the terrorists. They're the hardliners. They're the fundamentalists. They follow that kind of religion and that kind of Islam, and we're going to set ourselves aside from them. So listening to all of the things that Matt has said, I think are very true. There are definitely different narratives going on. There are definite different stories going on that are being told by Muslims about Muslims. But I still don't think enough of the people who are living in North America are watching this on a mass scale as they do the things that are truly essentializing. And unfortunately, for me, the primary identifier of terrorism today literally is the covered Muslim woman, and she represents terrorism still. And I don't see that going away anytime soon, especially when we just see, more and more countries starting to ban it. What do you think of that, Matt?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I've done previous work on veiling issues, as you know. Some people here might recall that the single largest flashpoint issue in the 2015 election that saw Justin Trudeau come to power was about an 8-month campaign about a woman named Zunira Isak and her right to wear a niqab during a swearing-in ceremony for Canadian citizenship. And what compelled me to write about this, because my background was in religion in the public sphere, broadly speaking, was that it seemed all of a sudden overnight, everyone had opinion on the niqab, many of whom didn't know the first thing about it the day before. And so it became this very interesting flashpoint moment where this visible symbol, a symbol of Islam, and as I think you're suggesting, not just Islam, but something that is often coded as extremist or terrorist, is linked to various acts of violence that were still very much in the air at that time. ISIS was still sort of dominant in the media. Is something that's pervasive. It's something that stays with us, of course. We're all familiar with the ongoing issues in Quebec on the banning of religious symbols, which disproportionately targeted Muslim women in all kinds of ways. And so, yeah, in addition to the many examples that you raised, it is a very live issue. And I guess I'll say in response, you said something about popular culture. My book project deals with a lot of different facets of representations of Islam, including news media, scholarship, among other things. I thought presenting on pop culture would not only be the most interesting for this audience, but also the most relatable. It's something you can all sort of go home and watch, and that you might be familiar with. It's more accessible than scholarship, for example. But I still think that it's a very difficult question to gauge, who is watching these shows, right? Despite the fact that Miss Marvel was very popular, how many people are engaging with Miss Marvel in a significant sense, statistically speaking? Ramy may have won Golden Globe Award, but I actually don't know a lot of people who've seen the show itself. One more point on this. Miss Marvel, I think, does a very interesting job with veiling issues. And so Kamala Khan does not wear a veil herself. She will put on a hijab when she enters into the mosque. But her best friend, Nakia, does. And throughout the show, she talks about her reasons for doing this. She's very much sort of an anti-imperialist. She's critical of state surveillance that their mosque experiences during the show. And so they do some interesting work in that particular program in addressing some of the nuances of that issue. But it's one example. Zarqa wears a hijab, but it doesn't necessarily come up politically in any direct or overt sort of ways. And I think it is very much the case that apart from those exceptions, Zarqa and Miss Marvel, most Muslim influencers in pop culture, Mo, Remy, we can think of Hassan Minhaj, for example, and a few others. They're all men. So it is, I think, a very male-dominated space as well.
I appreciate you mentioning that. I did try to find, actually, Muslim women in comedy, and I came up with 4 good names that are American. 2 of them actually wear the hijab, but they also build it into their act in order to try and break down the disassociation people have with people who look different, not just color, not just skin, hair, but also physical clothing. And that seems to be the biggest marker. I still think in media, whether it be television, film, comics, comedy. I think we've gotten to the point where we're lucky, in a sense, if I can actually say that we're allowing the veil to be accepted as the least problematic type of Islam, shall we say. That's inclusionary. That's, they can be considered belonging as opposed to not belonging. And that perhaps they're the second generation, and maybe by the third generation we can think maybe they won't be wearing it. That's the idea of becoming a member of a society, right? So that you become more like the mainstream, and the mainstream says take off your coverings, and take off your oppression and stop following all of these barbaric rules and ideas, which are always linked back to Muslim men. I do think it's interesting that every once in a while, when I do see a male comedian with a beard, I find it jarring, because I'm like, are they doing that because they're Muslim? Or are they doing that because they kept it post-COVID kind of thing, which kind of builds into that whole idea where a lot of the movies and a lot of the coverage of Muslims, if you wanted to be seen as belonging, as part of the American landscape, you wouldn't have a beard, you'd have a clean face. You can see that in, Hassan Minaj, and every once in a while, he'll grow one, but it disappears. And you can see it in Mo, whether he's got one or not becomes an issue. And I think, you can take that back to, simple things like even Aladdin, right? Aladdin is the only one who doesn't have a beard, whereas the evil father who wants to marry her daughter off to a Muslim has got this big beard. And, the man who wants to steal her and he's got evil intentions, got the really long beard. And so, we still have markers, identifiers of what makes somebody Muslim. And I think that that's a hard thing to get over still. It's still identified, right? And I think that's the problem with banning the burqa and the niqab and the chador. It becomes this idea where we create new markers of what's allowed and not allowed, right? And I don't know where that ends, because now we're blaming all women for terrorism at this point in time, Muslim women who wear those things as members of terrorist groups, right? Which is why they want to get rid of it. To the point where they find husbands and fathers, if a woman keeps wearing the burqa or the niqab, they'll find police. I think it was, I want to say it was Portugal, maybe, that said that they would find police for not making a woman take it off. And that it would go up incrementally each time, the first offense, second offense, third offense. So it's like, we need to focus on these women. And if we can get them to look like us, then we've won them over, and we've saved them from oppression and tyranny and terrorism. I don't know how we can get past that.
Well, if I could maybe bounce something in relation to what you were saying there. You reminded me of a case I discuss in my book, a shameless plug, Owning the Secular. Both the niqab affair during the Canadian election, as well as an interesting case in Spain, in the Catalonia region, in a town called Reus in 2010, saw this debate over banning face veils. And in order to not appear Islamophobic, and we saw this in Quebec as well, once there was pushback, governments would often say, well, we want to ban all masks, including ski masks, and they threw in public nudity, just for good measure to sort of deflect from what their original primary target was.
Right.
And one of the effects of the case in Reus in Spain, and this was also true of the niqab affair in 2015 in Canada, is that you saw commentators in news media and politicians making the case that, well, the hijab is actually religion and it's acceptable, but the niqab, that's culture. That's backwards culture. That's something we need to get rid of. You certainly know, as others do here, Laurie Beeman's done some interesting work on this sort of back and forth between religion and culture, right? What gets defined as religion and what gets defined as culture is often an expedient political tool to make something acceptable or unacceptable, as the case may be. And so I don't know quite what to do with that in relation to this, sudden acceptability among certain commentariat of the hijab because of the presence of the niqab. But one thing it certainly does is it potentially creates internal divisions within Muslim communities, right, as to who is acceptable and who is not. And so there's a lot of interesting political dynamics going on.
Yeah,
Cognizant of time, Ruby, do you have maybe one more question before we open up to the bigger conversation?
I wanted to ask Matt where he sees us going in the next step. I mean, we've seen what Jack Shaheen has put out there, and we've seen what Zarqa Nawaz has put out there. Where do you see us going in the next iteration of media? And maybe, I don't know, acceptance or appropriation of Islam. Which do you think?
Well, if I can bracket the uncertainty and chaos that we see with the Trump administration, that we see with social media and AI and all of the rapidly changing and uncertain variables that puts on the table. One thing that I think is worth paying attention to is how popular shows like Miss Marvel and Remy arguably set a standard for future creators, right? If they're not doing similar things to what those shows were doing, if they're not addressing internal racism, if they're reverting to Islam 101, if they're not pushing the envelope, talking about colonialism, they're likely to be subject to more criticism precisely because successful shows have raised the bar and done that. A show like Remy is the most theologically rich and yet funny and daring, often engaging in all kinds of uncomfortable sexual topics. For example, the main character, Remy, is plagued with his obsession with watching pornography and masturbating throughout the show. And there are any number of really uncomfortable and sometimes very humorous scenes where, instead of shying away from these types of controversies, in a playful way, he works out what it is to be Muslim, but also American in a culture where these things are real, where he's a human being, where these desires are alive. There's other examples that I don't even want to say here that are even more risque. So, teaser to watch Remy in that respect. But I think that, shows like that, arguably do set a new standard that we might see future creators take from and develop even further. Although, a lot of that is contingent on the political moment and what large media conglomerates are going to allow or not allow moving forward. So we shall see.
I'm just going to follow that up with one thing. I do think you're right. I do think that they are going to set standards where other people have to live up to them. And I think what we can see that in specifically is British film made by Muslims that have Muslim themes in them that are extremely complex but funny. There's a lot of humor in them. My Beautiful Laundrette. I'm blanking on all of the movies that I've watched that are British. Four Lions, even though they're about terrorism and families and your son becoming fundamentalist because he doesn't get along with his dad because his dad's gone on and dating a white woman. There's comedy in there, and I think comedy brings us together. And I do think that you have come onto something really good here. Thanks, Matt.
Thanks, Ruby.
Thanks. All right, so now we can open up to the room, both online and in person. So if anyone has a question. Yeah, Peter.
Matt, from the shows that I've seen from this list, a lot of the men, some of the women, are Pakistani Muslim, but not Indonesian. They're not Saudis, not Qataris, certainly not Iranians. Am I wrong? Am I missing something that they're mostly Pakistani Muslims? And does that make a difference that America is sees Islam in America as not African American, but Pakistani?
Absolutely, yeah. Little Mosque on the Prairie did represent a broader range of ethnicities, Lebanese, Nigerian, Pakistani, among others. But Miss Marvel features a Pakistani family. A lot of films feature a Pakistani family. I have a chapter on Islam according to literature, and my case study is on the work of Ayad Akhtar, who is born in the States, but he's of Pakistani heritage. And so there certainly is perhaps an overrepresentation or a larger representation of Pakistani cultures. And this does touch on a fundamental problem that a lot of scholars have pointed out, going back to Said and even before Said, where you find these, to take a term from Salah Mahmood, these semiotic collapses, right, where Muslims become conflated with a few images that exist in the ether. Of course, conflicts, especially in the Middle East with Iran and other Arab majority countries, also disproportionately create an idea of an image of what represents Islam. And as you suggest, that leaves out so many different cultures and communities. Yeah, so I mean, whether or not we're going to see a show featuring Indonesian communities or Malaysian communities, for example, certainly remains to be seen. Maybe it's worth noting that Ramy features an Egyptian family as well, so more Arab representation, but they do focus on their Egyptian culture, and they actually have 1 or 2 episodes in Cairo, right? And so that specificity is there as well. It's not just some generic Arab culture, but Egypt and Cairo in particular.
Yeah, Loretta.
Just to add to what Peter said, I think it's really important because it might go to your first question there in terms of have these shows set a new standard. So for me, like when I think about this, I think there's 2 things happening here. There's the macro level and then there's the micro level. So the macro is dealing with the racialization and identity politics and racism, colonialism, the racialization aspect of things. However, within that, the thing that I'm walking away with right now is like, what's the definition of Muslim? What are we talking about when we're saying Muslim in all of these movies and books and images that are being portrayed? And so there's the macro aspect of the racialization of Muslimness. However, there's the micro. When I say micro, I mean amongst Muslims, there's a lot of diversity, and Muslim itself is a number of sects. And amongst that, there's a lot of discrepancy and debates. And so niqab, for example, there's a lot of debate about going back to the Islamic text. Niqab is not mentioned in the Quran. So there's a debate around that. So I often describe this as, in terms of the Muslim identity, the standard. So Miss Marvel, I watched that whole series with my little nephews and my parents and my mom and the older generation. So it was interesting to see the reception from each sort of generational approach. And for us, born and raised here, my age range, we were like, oh yeah, this is great. And Miss Marvel the characters brought on the different aspects of identity and Muslimness and the various cultural things. But for the kids, the younger kids, they were kind of like, yeah, we're gonna go back to playing our zombie games on the internet, whatever, right? So, the micro aspect for me, born and raised in this country, I'm fighting the broader racism, but I'm also fighting the micro situation within the community where I have to deal with patriarchy and gender, but then I'm in the liminal space, right? So I have to be careful of, if I'm going to fight this patriarchy within my community, I don't want to racialize it further, where now you're going to have the right wing, broader community say, this is why we don't want Muslims here, right? So there's 2 things being played out. So that it's not a question, it's a comment, and that's what I see with all of this. It's good, but there's also deeper complexies in it.
I think I'll just jump in just because I was going to ask a question that I think comes out of this sort of approach is like, are you seeing, because I haven't watched all of these shows, I watched a few, but are you seeing some of that sort of internal debate and division about what Islam is, what it means to be Muslim? And because, I think earlier shows, there is enough of that pushing against, as Maharuna put it, that kind of micro narrative, that there is a bit of a common core story being told. Versus I'm wondering if you're noticing that there is like real evidence of the sort of internal diversity and division and opinion represented in these newer shows.
I think Miss Marvel attempts to do that a little bit with the diversity within Kabbalah's mosque community. Ramy even more so. I'll also say, the title of the book project, Islam According to Google News, is a little bit deceptive. It's meant to be sort of a catchy title, but to me, the heart of what I'm trying to argue is the comparison between 2 chapters, the one on popular culture and the one on scholarship. And part of what I'm trying to show is that the images and representations that we tend to see in popular culture are a tiny fraction of what gets talked about in scholarship. And so that comparison for me is a really important thing to flesh out in an empirical sense to say what it is that we talk about Islam and popular culture and news media is so much different than the work that's done by anthropologists going into communities, people looking at texts and historical narratives and so on and so forth, right? And it's very, very difficult, of course, to represent that complexity, especially when dealing with minoritized culture in North America. And so one of the things that I do in this chapter at the end, and I haven't decided whether I'm going to focus on Miss Marvel or Ramy, but I'm going to compare it to a Christian focus show called Midnight Mass, actually just filmed outside of Vancouver. Fantastic show, highly recommended. And the point of that comparison is to show that in a culture where Christianity is normative, so much doesn't have to be explained, it's just assumed, right? And so they don't have to do the kind of legwork that shows featuring Muslim themes do in order to represent that kind of complexity. I would say Ramy does a reasonably good job, to get to your question, in that there are several episodes that focus on Ramy's sister Dina and her struggle with wearing the hijab, not wearing the hijab, double standards within her own family. There's a show, or at least one episode, maybe two, focused on Ramy's mother and some of the humorous ways in which, you know, she starts to become a Lyft driver and encounters a non-binary person and misgenders them, and that becomes a whole thing, right? And so there's a lot of intergenerational dynamics that are played out. Ramy's sheikh at a Sufi mosque is Black. He marries a Black woman, the daughter of his sheikh, and they actually address some of these tensions and racializations within Muslim communities. So I think they're very consciously trying to deal with some of that as much as they can in a very limited format. So that would be the best example, I think, that I'm aware of so far in a North American context.
That's great. I think we have a question online. Todd?
Yeah, so we have a question from one of our in-house fellows, Suad, who presented a couple of weeks ago, or who was a conversation partner a couple of weeks ago. So Suad asks Matt to talk a little bit about, if possible, talk a little bit about Sara Ahmed's concept of effective conversions, and in particular with the focus on how affect sticks to the body through discourse. And Suad's suggesting that perhaps this is a way that we can think about affect attached to Muslim identities in the media,
right? And
how this helps us to consider power relations and feelings as presented.
Right. Yeah, I'm glad someone raised that issue. Happy to talk about it. I will talk about this in relation to two examples. So I mentioned the Danish cartoons previously. For those who are aware, the Danish cartoons were cartoons published in Denmark in 2005. They were rather, shall we say, inflammatory depictions of the Prophet Muhammad. And this sparked a lot of controversy and outrage and raised this sort of specter of free speech. And so the aforementioned book that included the work of Tva Asad and Saba Mahmoud on this controversy really started to dig into competing conceptions of free speech, and how when we are talking about freedom of speech in a Western context, the ways in which a lot of Muslim communities, and I don't want to overgeneralize, but a lot of Muslim communities relate to images and iconography are just not registered in Western conversations. And so it becomes very difficult to even have a conversation on terms that the community itself understands for itself, right? So Mahmoud talks about how in a lot of Muslim communities, the relationship with the Prophet Muhammad is not necessarily, communicative, but invokes a relation of similitudes, right? So what kind of actions did Muhammad engage in, and how can I, as a Muslim, embody those same actions in a certain way? And thinking about that particular relationship is meant to provoke a deeper understanding of how that was felt by Muslim communities, and not just simply by using the same Western standards of free speech. But it's an uphill battle because this is different language, different culture, different registers of understanding. Another example of effective conversion points referring to Sara Ahmed's work. One example that I've talked about previously is how in the 15 or so years following the September 11th attacks, there was a pretty constant stream of news media focusing on Muslims as terrorists, as violent, as the enemy, and so on and so forth. And I haven't backed this up empirically, but I got the sense that, strangely enough, despite the Muslim bans that Trump invoked in 2016, the media didn't focus nearly as much during his first administration on Muslims and Islam and terrorism as they did in the previous 15 years or so. But because it existed in the ether as an easily identifiable enemy, you saw it get reincorporated into new controversies. So in 2018, there was a so-called caravan swarming up from Latin America. And while this was manufactured to demonize migrants from Latin America, in at least 2 tweets, I think Trump was still on Twitter at the time, he talked about how all these dangerous migrants are coming from Latin America, and there were even prayer rugs found at the border. So re-invoking that image. And so this idea of effective conversion points it refers to the way in which certain images, registers of either love or fear or somewhere in between that exists in the cultural imagination might go away for a time, might be on the back burner, but as new enemies and new controversies and new images arise, you can reintroduce and restick those older images in new ways and new iterations. And so it's a way to think about how these stereotypes and these tropes are evolving and changing in all kinds of complicated ways. In a more positive sense, we could think of representatives like Rashida Tlaib, for example, Ilhan Omar. While they've been subject to a lot of demonization, they have nonetheless been pretty bold and consistent figures. And of course, Zoran Mamdani, despite all the controversies around him and all the negative attention, is someone who is generating a lot of buzz, and he doesn't shy away from his Muslim identity. So it'll be very interesting to see what kind of new affective or emotional registers arise once he is, by all polls, going to be elected mayor. That is if Trump doesn't swoop in and arrest him, which sounds crazy. We were talking a couple of years ago, but seems like a world we're living in right now.
I think we have time for one more question. Please, if anyone has one. Yeah.
Just a very quick question. Just what do you think about the last question that you raised up? What would happen to the West imaginary of Muslims after what happened in Gaza?
I mean, wow, that's a very, very difficult question. I mean, part of the reason why I raised Hamas is that it seems to me, and I have to do some more research to back this up, but the dominant narrative framing of this conflict is focused more on Hamas as the enemy to be defeated, as opposed to Muslims and Islam, which, again, in the 15 or so years following the September 11 attacks, we heard reproduced in the most unabashed Islamophobic ways in Western media. If that is in any way correct, does the comparatively disproportionate emphasis on Hamas create a different narrative or image in people's minds? Do they associate it with Islam and Muslims? And if so, to what ends or to what effects? I am not terribly optimistic about the ceasefire at present, nor am I optimistic about what kind of conflicts this might cause in the future as the death toll in Gaza continues to rise, and as the people who are trying to broker some sort of ceasefire or peace in the future don't seem to be acting in good faith or in a way that could actually lead to something positive moving forward. And so I certainly do have a concern that the more overt Islamophobic rhetoric we saw following 9/11 could easily be tapped into and resurrected again, because the situation is obviously live and ongoing and without any kind of clear path forward. So I don't know if that answered a very difficult question. But
What is fascinating, we don't have time to talk about this now, but I'm going to throw it into the room, is just looking at how the conflict in Gaza has actually transformed media representations of Muslim communities in contexts that I could have never imagined would have been supportive, like France, for example, right? So thinking about even just going back, 10 years ago, and how Islam, Muslims, Palestine would have been kind of framed within that media context, especially around Charlie Hebdo and that issue, and then to see the protests and the media coverage that it was supportive of Palestine and Gaza in France in just massive amounts is a pretty significant, potentially significant shift. So it'll be interesting to see how that
Right.
also.
Especially super quick with younger generations on mediums like TikTok, right,
Yeah.
where there is overwhelming outrage
Yeah.
at what's happening, right, and so that
Who knows?
could be a variable.
Stay tuned.
Who knows?
Yeah. Well, thank you, Matt.
Yeah.
And well, first, thank you. We have our very own Brian Pollock, Dr. Brian Pollock, who will be talking about the shape of the world, knowledge visualization in the medieval ages. So same time, same place next week. We will see you here for another fascinating SITS topic. So have a great night, everyone.